Okay, friends, I'm so excited for who I get to welcome back on the show. We have my friend Debra Filletta here. Debra, thanks so much for being here.
It's good to be back.
This is your second time on Girls, third time?
Either second or third, I don't totally remember, but we've definitely hung out before.
It's so good. It's so good. Well, I've been a fan of yours forever and ever. We'll link to the other episodes in the show notes for anyone who hasn't gotten to hear from you before. But if this is someone's first time meeting you, can you tell us who you are, what you do, and a fun fact about yourself?
Yeah, I am a licensed professional counselor. I am a mom of 4. We have a kid in each stage of life right now. We have a toddler, elementary schooler, middle schooler, and high schooler. And then my husband and I have been married for 17, going on 18 years. And we've just got a full life with kids in different seasons. And I write books. I do some counseling. I have a national counseling ministry. So I get to travel all across the country and talk about mental and emotional health. I have a podcast and just kind of all things under the umbrella of getting healthy and being in healthy relationships.
I love that. I love that. So you have so much going on. And also you have so much, like such a deep well of experience in the area of the topic that we're talking about today. You also have a new book out, which I like. You have the most incredible collection of books that you have written. It is truly amazing. Tell us about the new book and kind of I know every book that an author writes has a backstory to it.
Yeah.
I feel like, we were just talking about this before we started, but writing books is hard. And one of the reasons that it's hard is that you have to live it first.
Yeah.
And sometimes I walk around, a bookstore and I think like, I just have such compassion for the different names I see on the books. Cause I'm like, not only did you write this, but you had to live it first. So anyway, tell us about your new book and kind of the backstory.
Yeah. Well, my newest book is called Soul Care. It's book number 7. I wonder if that means something. I was just telling you a minute ago, this book feels like it was a very special book to write. I guess 7 is the number of completion, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the year of Jubilee and all of those different things that 7 represents, which I'm just thinking about now. But it was a really special book because I feel like it was given to me. It was God's gift to me. And oftentimes I write books from my personal experience, but it's for my clients, for my readers, for the church. Whereas I feel like this book was for me first. It was a gift. I wrote it in 16 and a half days, which is just like, it doesn't even make sense, but it was truly something I'd been marinating in. And I just felt like God was like, here, you need this. Mm-hmm. And it's the idea that in order for us to pour out in the way that God calls us to pour out, we need to be filled. And oftentimes as Christians, we're not. We're empty and depleted and running on fumes and we're burnt out. And when Jesus says that we are to be a light that shines bright, I really think that the opposite of that is a light that's been burnt out, a light that's been snuffed. When we sing in 2nd grade, this little light of mine, and then we say, I won't let Satan it out. But unfortunately, as a counselor, I have seen so many people whose light has been burnt out. And I do think that's a tactic of the enemy, is for us to just be flickering at best, if not completely burnt out. And so soul care is a message about filling up in healthy ways. It's about the 6 rhythms that Jesus practiced to care for his soul during his time on earth. And I think that's what sets this book apart from my others. My books are all integrative, like faith and psychology and counseling, but this book was specifically zooming in on the life of Christ and what he did to fill up, because he had so much to pour out. I mean, he was fully God, yet fully man. And he chose to honor the limitations of his human body, his humanity. And if he honored his limitations, how much more do we need to be aware of and honor ours? And so it was just kind of delving into the Gospels through that lens and seeing the life of Jesus and how he practiced a full life and was intentional about staying filled.
What is the difference? If you've spent 4 seconds on a place like Instagram, you've heard people talk about self-care. And, normally I think we think of self-care as like a mud mask and I don't know, like bubble bath. Fill in your spa treatment of choice. But what's the difference between, like, where does self-care end and soul care start? What's the difference between the two?
Well, I see self-care as those superficial one-time acts that make us feel good in the moment. And I don't think there's anything wrong with them. There's nothing wrong with a mani-pedi or a bubble bath or massage or whatever it is that people put in that category, But I do think that soul care is deeper. Soul care isn't a one-time act to quick fix a problem. Soul care are deep, long-lasting rhythms that keep us filled so that we don't get to that point where we're crashing and we need a quick fix. And sometimes the self-care we run to can be benign, like a manicure, right? But other times it's dangerous. Other times it's empty things. And empty things can't fill empty people, right? So we go to scrolling or spending or sugar or substances or porn or alcohol or unhealthy relationships or YouTube videos till 3 a.m. or whatever it is to kind of numb instead of actually face the pain point and figure out how to keep it from happening over and over and over again. So we get into this pattern of feeling tired, burnt out, empty, depleted, and then quick fix or quick numb. And then we go into it again the next day and the next day and the next day without really getting truly filled up. And so that's the difference between soul care and self-care, is I believe soul care is about long lasting rhythms that keep us filled.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what are some of the like rhythms or I'm trying to think of the word that you used. The first one that's coming to mind is tricks, not tricks. But what are some of the things? Yeah, what are some of the rhythms that you found that Jesus did and that you've identified as like some things that aren't quick fixes, but actually fill us up?
Well, before I give you the summary of the 6 rhythms, I think it's really important to understand that even just trying to apply the rhythms quickly is a quick fix, right? Like, okay, so let's say one of the rhythms is the rhythm of protect. It's all about setting boundaries. I can get in there and clear my schedule for the month and be like, okay, I set boundaries. But if I don't get to the roots of why I do what I do, my underlying belief system, then I'm going to keep repeating the cycle of burnout. So the first 5 chapters is actually spending some time getting to the roots of why we get stuck in a burnout cycle, some of those underlying beliefs that are rooted in trauma rather than in God's truth. And I think there's 2 parts to this. One is misguided theology. I think many of us come in to Christian culture thinking that it's our job to focus on everybody else at the expense and neglect of ourself, which is not biblically accurate. It's a misguided interpretation of scripture. And we could spend hours on that. There's a whole chapter on that in the book. But I also believe that the second part of it is misguided belief systems that we carry from childhood. And I did a soul care series on my podcast. My podcast is called Talk to Me, and it's on-air counseling sessions and hotline calls. And I did a soul care series where people came on to talk about which of the rhythms that they struggled with the most and why. And it was really interesting, Stephanie, because there was 3 personality types that came to the surface of people who struggle most with caring for their souls, people who struggle most with identifying their needs. The first were firstborns. Like the response. Are you a firstborn?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I am too. And I actually dedicated this book to my daughter, who is a firstborn, because I see these traits in her. It's like this overarching sense of responsibility and parent pleasing and filling in the gaps and wanting to be all things to all people. And in counseling, we say that behind every people pleaser was once a parent pleaser. So it's like that cycle remains with us, of just putting other people first, filling in the gaps at the neglect of our needs. The second personality type were people who came from a family where there was some sort of chaos or dysfunction, in the sense that somebody else had higher needs. Maybe it was a rebellious sibling. And it was just so much chaos and so much stress. Maybe it was a family dynamic where mom and dad were fighting all the time and there was so much chaos. Maybe there was an addiction or a disability or something in the family. Maybe there were so many kids, like 12 kids, And it was just so many other needs that then you put your needs on the back burner. It's like, well, there's too much going on here. And in order to keep equilibrium in this home, somebody's got to pull back. Yeah. And so we become people who just put our needs on the back burner or ignore them altogether.
Yeah.
The third personality type that came to the surface were people who came from a home where mom and dad were unavailable for some reason. I heard the word frazzled mom a lot in my interviews, which I found really fascinating. Like mom was so overwhelmed, so stressed, so frazzled all the time that it's like, if I'm a child with needs and I go to mom and she's too stressed, can't handle anymore. So then I take my needs and maybe I try to go to dad and he's overworked or he's an alcoholic or he's emotionally disconnected or apathetic or whatever. And so I go to dad and he's not available. So then what do I do with my needs? I just repress them, ignore them, or try to deal with them myself. And some people listening and they're like, yep, check, like all 3. And think about how these things impact us as we become Christians, as we go through life. We're people who aren't really good at recognizing the signals our body is sending us through our needs because we've gotten so good at tuning them out and focusing on everybody else until we get to a point where we're breaking down and we're not healthy and we're struggling and we're overtired and we're fatigued and we're burnt out. And I do think soul care is such an important message because I think it's the prelude to mental health struggles. It's the preventative maintenance. It's the body saying, pay attention. But sometimes we treat it like imagine you're in your car and all the dash lights start going off. You don't judge your car. Like, what's wrong with this car? Why won't it keep going? Why is it so weak? We judge ourselves and we push through instead of pulling over to do things differently. And then eventually something breaks down. So getting to our underlying belief systems, that's where I start with soul care. That's why I start there, because I just feel like it's so essential to figuring out why we are perpetually stuck in this cycle.
That's so interesting. And so, I feel like everyone is nodding for some reason. And for me, I'm a firstborn. My house didn't have too much chaos growing up, but I totally we were just talking, I'm a parent of 2 3.5-year-olds. And so I get mom being frazzled mom, I can relate to that. But also I can imagine how as a kid, if your mom just doesn't have space for you enough times, you stop asking for it.
Right. And it's interesting, Steph, even as a mom, I think about when I'm not filled. Like sometimes as a mom, and this is sidetrack, I know, because not everybody listening is a mom, but for those of us who are, sometimes you feel guilty soul care. It's like, I don't have time. I shouldn't spend time doing this, whatever. But the problem with that guilt is when we aren't filled and we're functioning out of empty places, we become frazzled moms. When we're frazzled moms, our kids can't come to us with their needs. And then they become people who stuff their needs. Fast forward 30 years, and it perpetuates the cycle. You know, people who are just shoving their needs down out of guilt, out of false beliefs, out of whatever. But then you become that mom who has no capacity.
Yeah.
So if we actually want to break the cycle, we've got to focus on what does it mean for me to be healthy and filled so that I can pour out to the capacity that God has me pouring out. And higher levels of pouring out require higher levels of filling. I have one 3.5-year-old. I require less filling than you who has two 3.5-year-olds. You know what I mean? Like higher seasons of pouring out demand higher seasons of filling.
Yeah.
And Jesus talk about high seasons of pouring out, which is why we see him being so intentional to stay filled.
This is also good. It's the thing that is standing out to me also, as you were talking about filling in the gaps or being helpful or, not adding to the chaos, but instead, quieting your own chaos so you can just kind of keep a little bit of equilibrium in your home. That I think one of the things that's always felt tricky to me about my own needs is that we're not celebrated for having needs. We're celebrated when we don't.
You're right.
We're celebrated when we are the last one leaving the bake sale, or when we are, outperforming everyone else at work, or when we are, we've eaten half a dino nugget all day but our kids have, the most nutritious, natural, healthy meals. It's
Right.
like we're praised for that. So how do we, as you mentioned, like a lot of people would say that feels biblical, to like consider yourself nothing and pour out to everybody else. Debunk that a little bit for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think we have to be careful too with how we interpret scripture. The Bible does say consider others better than yourself, but it doesn't say consider yourself nothing. The Bible does say love your neighbor as you love yourself, but Jesus doesn't say don't love yourself. He doesn't even say love your neighbor more than you love yourself. He says love your neighbor as you love yourself. There's a balance there. The Bible does say that it's the enemy who comes to steal and kill and destroy. And Jesus comes that we could have life abundant. In another translation, it says life in all of its fullness. The Bible does say in 3 John that it is our prayer that you prosper in every way, even as your soul prospers. The Bible does talk about being filled with the knowledge of the love of God so that we can be filled to all fullness. But so many of us are not full. We're empty. And so I really think that we have to be careful not to interpret scripture through the lens of our trauma, through the lens of those faulty belief systems, and instead interpret it through what the Bible actually says, and specifically as modeled through the life of Jesus.
Yeah.
He was so good at practicing these 6 rhythms. And, even just, I probably wrote the book so quickly because there was just so much there. When you look at scripture through the lens of soul care, when you look at the gospels through the lens of Jesus's life, all these things stand out that I never saw before through the life of Jesus. But even the most basic rhythm, the rhythm of nourish, which is about nutrition, hydration, and movement. There's 3 chapters in that section, and they go into the science and psychology of nutrition, the science and psychology of hydration, and of movement. But to see that even Jesus was aware of his physical needs and honored his physical capacity. When he was traveling and he got tired, he stopped in Samaria. The only reason he stopped was because he was tired. If you actually read the passage, and he stopped at the well, and the disciples went to get food, and then Jesus interacts with the Samaritan woman and he says, "Will you get me a drink?" He was thirsty. He was hungry. He responded to his human capacity by stopping to eat, drink, and rest. And of course, there was a much bigger picture at work with his interaction with the Samaritan woman, but we cannot ignore his humanity in that moment of just being aware. My body needs to drink. I need to stop and take care of myself. That one of those chapters is called "It Might Not Be a Demon. It Might Just Be Dehydration." Because oftentimes we neglect to nourish our body. We eat that half a dino nugget, like you said, don't have a sip of water all day. We've hardly moved. And then at the end of the day, we're tired, irritable, angry, cranky, and we're like spiritual warfare when it's self-sabotage. The enemy's like, I don't even have to do anything. You did it all yourself. Great job. Self-neglect, self-sabotage. The opposite of self-obsession, which we don't want to be self-obsessed. So we do the opposite, which is self-neglect. But both of those things cause us to be so self-centered, because when you feel horrible and tired and weak and empty, you can't think of anyone but yourself and how bad you feel. Your kids come in and you're like, I am done. I have nothing left right now. Your husband comes in and is like, leave me alone. I have nothing left. You can't think of anyone but yourself when you've self-neglected.
Yeah.
And so the first section is just about those three things under the umbrella of the rhythm of nourish and how Jesus practiced those things in his own life.
Keep going. I'm like, okay, number 2. What's number 2?
Number 2 is the rhythm of rest. And it talks about how Jesus took naps and paced himself. It's about sleep, the science and psychology and neurology of sleep and how much sleep we need, but it's also about rhythms of rest, living a restful life, a life that's paced. When I always talk to my clients about living at 85%. Like, don't live at 100. You wouldn't spend 100% of your paycheck. So why do you spend 100% of your emotional capacity? Live at 85%, And when I actually looked at the Sabbath, 7 days, 1 day of rest, 6 days of work, you know what that calculates to? 85 point blah, 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 blah percent. And it was just really cool to see that, because it's something I've been teaching clients, and I didn't ever make the connection that that's also the equation of a Sabbath life.
Yeah.
Is looking at our life in a slower pace and with margin, So it's about Jesus taking naps. We actually created a t-shirt for Soul Care that says Jesus took naps. Be more like Jesus. Because sometimes we need that reminder that it's not about the hustle and grind and go, go, go. When people say, oh, I slept 2 hours because I'm, doing all this stuff, it terrifies me. Like, breakdown is around the corner. And I also spend some time talking about insomnia in this section and why it matters and what it means and what our body might be signaling to us and how it's important to pay attention in those seasons where we're not getting good sleep. So that's the section of rest. We go into the section of connect, and that's all about life-giving relationships versus life-taking relationships, the ones that aren't so healthy. And it's a challenge to have good friends and be a good friend. And it analyzes the life of Jesus and his friendships and how he engaged in give and take in relationships, because we don't always see that. We don't always look for that in the life of Christ. So it's all about community and friendships and our tendency to isolate. And then we go into the section called protect, which is about boundaries, learning to protect your calling, learning to protect your energy, learning to protect your relationship with God, and saying no and not yet, and how often Jesus did that, and how he was so clear on his calling that he wasn't influenced by the obligation of man. It was like, nope, I'm not doing that because this is what I've been called to do. And so practicing some of that in our life as we protect what God has called us to, and protecting our time with the Father, how often Jesus went away just to be alone with the Father. You just need to get his heart filled, And then we go into the rhythm of savor, which is about being present and enjoying life and just being in the moment, not what's next or the worries of tomorrow or the regrets of the past or the phone buzzing in our pockets, but just learning to savor and be present. You can't multitask and savor. It doesn't happen. It's impossible. So learning to be mindful and savor life. And that section is all about things like enjoying life, finding joy in life, Thanksgiving and celebration, and just being in the moment, being present. And then, which honestly was my favorite section, like by far my favorite section for type A, firstborn, like let's get things done kind of person. That was the one that spoke the most to my heart. And then the last section is tune in. And it's about being aware of your emotional world underneath the surface and what your emotions and body are signaling and how to respond to your emotions in a healthy way and recognize things that might be coming from trauma, and just kind of a deeper look into being an emotionally healthy person and tuning in just like Jesus did. Jesus had over 39 different emotions and he responded to his emotions in healthy ways. He never ignored them or repressed them. And so it's all about just tuning into how we feel and responding in healthy ways.
I love all of this. I'm like, these are my favorite things. Because, I mean, really, if you had to ask me to name the 6 most life-giving things in my life, they would be all of these.
Yeah.
It's helpful for me to like look at things this way. What happens if we don't? What happens if we don't? If we don't take care of our souls? Like extrapolate this out a little bit for us. What's at stake?
I think everything. I think when we're empty, we have nothing left to pour out. We're not pouring out well if we're even able to pour out. And so it affects everything. It affects our marriage. It affects our parenting. It affects our ministries. I think we're most susceptible to sin when we're empty and depleted and burnt out and tired, We know in counseling and psychology, things like Alcohol Anonymous and all the different treatment programs, they say, do not let yourself get hungry, angry, lonely, tired, or sick, right? Like do not act out of those places because you're more likely to fall back into addiction. I think it applies to so much in life. Do not do things when you are depleted physically, emotionally, relationally, because that's when you will falter and fail, when you're not armed and filled. And I think when we see people falling from the height of ministry, it's usually not because of a lack of spiritual knowledge. It's usually because of emptiness and this stress that we're going to empty things to try and fill us up rather than the only things that can fill us up, which are modeled in the life of Christ, God himself, and then all of these healthy rhythms. So I think so much is at stake. I think that our personal health and the health of everyone that we have the privilege of touching within our ministry, within our life, within our calling.
This is so important. I'm so glad that you wrote this book, and I appreciate how cleanly you broke it down. Like even just hydrate. Like that's the amount of times that I'm like, wow, I think I'm getting sick, or like, am I nauseous? Like, do I have a stomach bug or something? And I'm like, I drink a glass of water and I feel 1,000 times better.
Yeah,
man, I just didn't realize how little water I had had today. And I mean, I know that this is something that I battle in myself, is wanting to be like resisting rest, wanting to show up, wanting to help, wanting to check one more thing off the list, not wanting to like, it's hard to say like, I can't do more. That feels just like you were saying with our car. We're not mad at our car for running out of gas, but like we certainly get mad at ourselves. And so if there are people who are like, I get this in my head, but like, I don't know how to get past those beliefs that like I should always be able to do more.
Yeah.
Talk
Well,
to me
I
about
would
that.
say, first of all, I do think those beliefs come from really deep places. And as a counselor, I really believe that counseling can be a really big part to uncovering some of those roots and getting unstuck. It's going to take some work to go back and rewrite those narratives, align them to truth, and get them out of the foundation of trauma. And that takes some work. But I also would add to that I think there's a hint of pride in our inability to honor our capacity. It's like, I think I can do it all. I think I should do it all. I think I'm the one that's going to fill in the gaps, rather than the humility to know this is all I have. And Jesus, I trust that you are going to multiply these loaves and fish because only you can. And this is all I have. I'm not going to pretend and push and try to be more than I am capable of. So I do think oftentimes it's a pride issue.
Yeah.
Even in those of us who think we're so serving and selfless. But really, if you look at it, there's pride that makes us think that it's our job to fix all the problems and to fill in all the gaps and to do it all, instead of saying, Lord, this is all I have and I want to honor you with it. And I know that you're going to fill in the gaps that I can't. So I think it's just tweaking our beliefs and facing our pride.
Yeah. And I mean, it takes a lot of faith, and it takes a lot of also trust in other people to delegate things, or to say, you know what, I can't fix that, or that's outside my capacity, or that's outside my sphere of influence. Like I can't do anything about that.
Right. Or even I can, but I shouldn't.
Oof.
Just because you can doesn't mean you should, doesn't mean it's yours to own. Like I can take a call at 1 a.m. from a client. That doesn't mean I should.
Yeah.
Right. So I think also recognizing what God has called us to versus what we can do, because there's a lot we can do, but it doesn't mean that God has called us to it all.
Talk more about that, because I think, today I'm thinking about, there's so much, any day, there's so much hurt in the world. There's so many things going on, so many people who need help and resources, and to know that they're not forgotten. And like, there are so many needs. How do we know which ones are ours to meet? But not just that, what do we do with the ones that aren't ours?
Yeah. Well, the hard part about this is there's not a formula, in the sense that God calls each person to such different things and such different tasks. But I think that's where being in tune to God's Spirit is so important. And going back to the rhythm of protecting our time with the Father, because that's where we're learning and hearing the most. That's where we're downloading his voice and tuning into what he wants us to do, so that the voices of others aren't so influential, because his voice is the loudest. And it's like, well, I know this is what God has called me to do. So even when other people are pushing me or pressuring me, the voice of God in my life is louder and more clear.
Yeah.
And I do think that time with the Father is so precious. I think it was so precious for Jesus's own nurturing, but how much more in our own life. And that's usually the thing that drops off our schedule first. Like, I didn't have time today to get right with God and to listen and tune in to his Spirit. But we won't be able to know the cans from the shoulds, from the calling, from the obligations, unless we're really tuning in to God's voice and his Spirit. And I also think tuning into our physical responses, like when we're walking in God's calling, I believe Proverbs 11:11, you who refresh will also be refreshed. And I think there is a level of which that we're trying to do so much that doesn't belong to us that it no longer feels refreshing in any way, shape, or form. And so tuning into our body, tuning into the signals our body is sending us. So tuning into God first, and then our body, not our body first. Because I think sometimes if we just tune in to our body without tuning into what God is saying, we could get really confused, you know? So that would be my advice, is protect your time with the Father, protect your calling.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. The last question I wanted to ask you was, I know that I'm so grateful that we're talking about our mental health more than ever before. And I hope that a lot of the stigma that's existed forever, I know that a lot of it has fallen away, but I know that it hasn't fallen away for everybody. And so if there is someone who is feeling like I'm really not doing well, like I'm burning out, my relationships are suffering, I'm really like my head is not a happy place to be, and it hasn't been for a while. What do you like? Is there anything that you can share with them? Yeah, what would you want to share with them?
Yeah. First of all, it's really normal to get to that point in life. Our mind is a battlefield, and there's just so much work that has to be done with how we think, because it affects how we feel, which then affects what we do. So it's totally normal to struggle internally and to feel defeated and to be tired and to just feel done and to feel like you're not okay. And it's so normal to have those moments. It is not a reflection of your faith. It's just a reflection of the burdens of this life. But I do think that the good news is that even in that, there's hope and there's healing. And, so much of why we feel the way we feel and why we think the way we think goes back to the things we've learned along the way that were rooted in unhealthy experiences or trauma or difficulties of life. And so the beauty of counseling is that you get to go back and rewrite some of those old stories in new and different ways, rewrite some of the thought processes, understand some of the feelings and what they mean and how to respond in healthy ways, rather than feeling like you're just walking around clueless without a map, having to figure it out on your own. I've just watched the Lord work so much through counseling in my own life, but also through my counseling and through my team of counselors, how God has just brought so much healing and hope to people. And God wants us to partner with him on the journey of healing. I noticed in scripture, oftentimes when God would heal, it was a process of, do you believe? Do you want this? Okay, then here's what I want you to do. Stretch out your hand, even though you feel paralyzed. Get up and take your mat, even though you feel like you don't have the ability. Partner with me and let's do this together. And when you're in that difficult place, I believe that God is just inviting you into a deeper level of healing. Sometimes we can judge ourselves rather than see it as an invitation. Like, I'm just taking you to the next level. And so I would encourage you to press into that and do your part so that you can receive the invitation of getting to the next level in your journey of healing.
I love that. I love that. Debra, thank you so much for your work and for being here and for sharing this with us. We're going to link to the book on our show notes so that everyone can go get it. And thank you for coming to Girls Night.
Thank you for having me. It's always a blast to be with you.